In the volatile landscape of international geopolitics, few materials are as coveted or as feared as enriched uranium. The single most sought-after substance in the world today is not gold nor diamonds, but 408 kilograms of Iranian enriched uranium, a quantity sufficient to alter the global balance of power irrevocably. This material, the critical component for a nuclear weapon, has become the focal point of a crisis that has drawn in the world's major powers, threatening to ignite a conflict with catastrophic consequences. The frantic search for this missing uranium encapsulates the profound anxieties of our time, where the line between a fragile peace and all-out war is perilously thin. The question of its whereabouts hangs over every diplomatic meeting, every intelligence briefing, and every headline, a silent testament to a world on edge. The tension has been exacerbated by the bold and often belligerent rhetoric of world leaders. Former US President Donald Trump, along with his so-called obliteration squad, has made it clear that he cannot tolerate even the slightest challenge to American and Israeli strategic dominance. His repeated use of the word obliterate signifies a policy of absolute destruction, leaving no room for nuance or negotiation. On the other side of this dangerous equation, Israel, having already demonstrated its military might by inflicting an estimated $750 million in daily damages during a recent 12-day conflict, remains steadfast in its mission to prevent a nuclear-armed Iran. This high-stakes standoff is not merely a regional dispute. It is a global predicament that tests the limits of diplomacy and the effectiveness of military deterrence. The historical context of this conflict is deeply rooted and fraught with bitterness. David Ben-Gurion, the first Zionist prime minister, famously articulated a long-term vision for the region, reportedly expressing a belief that the old Palestinians would eventually die and their children would forget their homeland. This sentiment, whether apocryphal or not, reflects a generational struggle over land and identity that continues to fuel the conflict today. For Iran, the stakes are equally high. The recent 12-day battle has already cost its economy an estimated $35 billion, a staggering sum for a nation already grappling with severe sanctions. This immense financial and human cost underscores the gravity of the situation, pushing Iran further into a corner where desperate measures might seem like the only viable option. The central question that emerges from this tangled web of historical grievances and modern-day power plays is whether America and Israel are executing a preconceived plan. Is there a Lebanon model, a strategy of sustained military pressure and economic strangulation designed to cripple a nation from within, that is now being applied to Iran? The possibility is chilling, suggesting a long-term strategy of attrition aimed at regime change or complete dismantlement of Iran's military and nuclear infrastructure. As the world watches, the actions and statements of all parties are scrutinized for clues, as the answer to this question will determine whether the path forward leads to a negotiated peace or a devastating large-scale war that could engulf the entire Middle East and beyond. The current crisis escalated dramatically on the night of June 22nd, when the United States launched Operation Midnight Hammer. This covert military action targeted 3 of Iran's key nuclear sites: Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. In the immediate aftermath, Washington embarked on a concerted campaign to convince the world that the operation was a resounding success. The Pentagon released satellite imagery purporting to show the devastating impact of the strikes, highlighting 6 distinct impact points on the heavily fortified Fordow enrichment plant, which is buried deep within a mountain. These images, showing massive craters gouged into the rock, were presented as undeniable proof that the Iranian nuclear program had been neutralized, its most secure facility breached and effectively destroyed for the foreseeable future. To further bolster their claims, American officials showcased before and after aerial photographs of the enrichment plants at Isfahan and Natanz. The images were intended to demonstrate the pinpoint accuracy of their munitions, showing how specific buildings and infrastructure had been meticulously selected and destroyed. The message was clear and unequivocal. The world could rest easy, as the threat of an Iranian nuclear bomb had been eliminated. The Pentagon asserted with unwavering confidence that their superclass targeting systems had performed flawlessly, leaving no doubt about the outcome. This narrative of total success was aggressively pushed during international media briefings, where the primary objective was to project an image of overwhelming American military superiority and technological prowess. However, this triumphant narrative began to unravel almost as soon as it was constructed. During a Pentagon press briefing, seasoned international journalists began to probe deeper, asking pointed questions about the true extent of the damage. They questioned whether Operation Midnight Hammer had merely dented Iranian nuclear capability or truly annihilated it. Were the facilities at Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan completely destroyed, or did they retain some operational capacity? What had become of the estimated 18,000 centrifuges? And most critically, where was the 408 kilograms of enriched uranium that Iran was believed to possess? Enough to build several atomic bombs within months? These were not questions that could be waved away with confident assertions or vague pronouncements. In response to this intense scrutiny, President Trump and his Defense Secretary, Peter Hextall, along with their entire team, seemed to be at a loss for concrete answers. Instead of providing detailed damage assessments or evidence, they repeatedly fell back on the word obliterated. They insisted that Iran's nuclear program had been wiped from existence, its facilities reduced to rubble, and its ambitions permanently thwarted. Yet, this aggressive rhetoric failed to satisfy the press. Conspicuously, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Ken McKenzie, standing beside the Defense Secretary, chose his words more carefully. He refrained from using the term obliterated, opting instead for phrases like severe damage and destruction, suggesting a less than total outcome and hinting at the complexities of a thorough battle damage assessment. The official American narrative of total obliteration was dealt a significant blow just 2 days after the strikes. On June 24th, CNN published a bombshell report based on a leaked preliminary assessment from the Defense Intelligence Agency. This internal report, which had already been delivered to President Trump and his top military advisors, directly contradicted the public statements coming from the White House and the Pentagon. The DIA's initial findings concluded that the strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities were not entirely successful and, crucially, did not destroy the basic infrastructure. This revelation sent shockwaves through the international community and caused immense embarrassment for the political and military leadership in Washington, exposing a deep disconnect between their public claims and the intelligence community's private assessments. According to the leaked DIA report, the damage inflicted upon Iran was limited and the country could likely recover its capabilities within a matter of months. This assessment suggested that Iran would soon be back to the same position it was in before Operation Midnight Hammer was even launched. The leak itself was a major scandal, indicating a serious breach within the highest echelons of the US defense establishment and hinting at internal dissent over the administration's handling of the crisis. Compounding the issue, Iranian officials had already begun to push their own counter-narrative even before the DIA report surfaced. They claimed to have moved the most critical materials, including fissile material and other sensitive components, from the Fordow, Isfahan, and Natanz sites long before the American attacks, thereby rendering the strikes largely ineffective. These conflicting accounts shifted the global focus from the military operation itself to the credibility of President Trump and his administration. How could they tolerate any suggestion that their much-vaunted obliteration was anything less than total? In response, President Trump lashed out with fury, accusing news organizations like CNN, NBC, and the New York Times of peddling fake news and being enemies of the American military's success. Yet amidst his tirades, he conspicuously avoided the central question. Where was the enriched uranium? He offered no proof that the material had been destroyed, nor did he provide any evidence of the complete devastation of Iran's broader nuclear program components, leaving a gaping hole in his narrative of absolute victory. In a desperate attempt to regain control of the narrative, the Pentagon called another press conference. This time, they came armed with what they promised was definitive proof: a special video presentation. In front of a room full of international journalists, the Defense Secretary attempted a modern high-tech presentation meant to silence all doubts. However, the exclusive video they played was a profound disappointment. It was not footage of the actual strikes on Iran, but an old test video of a B-2 bomber dropping a GBU-57 bunker buster bomb on a test range. The video merely proved that the bomb could penetrate a reinforced concrete roof and detonate inside a tunnel. It offered no technical data or direct evidence related to the Iranian sites, creating more confusion than clarity and further fueling skepticism about the true outcome of Operation Midnight Hammer. The road to the current crisis is a long and winding one, paved with decades of deep-seated mistrust and historical grievances. The relationship between Iran and the United States, once one of strategic partnership, was irrevocably fractured by the 1979 Islamic Revolution, which overthrew the US-backed Shah. This event transformed the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East, replacing a key American ally with a revolutionary theocracy that defined itself in opposition to American influence, famously branding the US as the Great Satan. This foundational animosity has colored every interaction since, creating a perpetual cycle of suspicion and hostility. For Washington, the revolution represented a strategic loss and the rise of a destabilizing force, while for Tehran, it marked the end of foreign domination and the birth of a new, independent identity. This legacy of mistrust extends equally to Iran's relationship with Israel. The animosity here is not just political, but existential. Since the revolution, Iran's leaders have consistently refused to recognize Israel's right to exist, referring to it as the Zionist entity and supporting proxy groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, dedicated to its destruction. For Israel, a nuclear-armed Iran is not a theoretical threat, but a direct challenge to its very survival. This sentiment is encapsulated in the historical rhetoric of leaders like David Ben-Gurion, who envisioned a future where the Palestinian presence was diminished. While the context was different, the underlying principle of ensuring Zionist dominance remains a core tenet of Israeli security policy, making the prospect of a nuclear Iran an intolerable red line that must be prevented at any cost. The roots of the nuclear standoff itself can be traced back to the early 2000s, when the existence of Iran's clandestine nuclear program was first revealed. This discovery triggered international alarm and led to years of sanctions and tense diplomatic negotiations. Iran has always maintained that its program is for peaceful energy purposes, a claim met with profound skepticism by the West and Israel, who point to the program's military dimensions and Iran's history of concealment. The international community, led by the P5+1 powers, the US, UK, France, China, Russia, and Germany, engaged in a delicate diplomatic dance, trying to find a solution that would cap Iran's nuclear ambitions without resorting to military force, a task complicated by the deep-seated enmities on all sides. This complex history forms the bedrock upon which the current crisis is built. Every action and reaction is interpreted through a lens of past betrayals and future fears. For Iran, Western pressure is seen as an attempt to stifle its sovereign right to technological advancement and maintain a regional power imbalance. For the US and Israel, Iran's nuclear pursuits are viewed as a deceptive march toward acquiring the ultimate weapon to threaten its neighbors and disrupt global security. This fundamental clash of perspectives, fueled by decades of conflict, espionage, and hostile rhetoric, created a political environment where diplomatic solutions became increasingly fragile and the path to military confrontation seemed almost inevitable, setting the stage for the dramatic escalation to come. So a brief, hopeful chapter in this long history of antagonism opened in 2015 with the signing of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, what most people know as the Iran nuclear deal. This landmark agreement, which was painstakingly negotiated over several years, was meant to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon in exchange for lifting those crippling international economic sanctions. Under the terms of the deal, Iran agreed to drastically limit its uranium enrichment, dismantle a significant portion of its centrifuges, and allow intrusive inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency. In return, billions of dollars in frozen Iranian assets were released, and the nation was reintegrated into the global economy. For a moment, it really seemed like diplomacy had triumphed, offering a peaceful pathway to resolve one of the world's most dangerous security challenges. The JCPOA was hailed by its supporters as a masterclass in international diplomacy, a testament to the power of negotiation over confrontation. It was built on the principle of distrust and verify, acknowledging the lack of faith between the parties but creating a robust framework of monitoring to ensure compliance. The deal successfully rolled back Iran's nuclear program, extending its so-called breakout time, the time it would take to produce enough fissile material for a single bomb, from just a few months to over a year. This provided a crucial buffer, giving the world ample time to detect and respond to any potential Iranian move to build a weapon. The agreement represented a delicate balance, a compromise where neither side got everything it wanted, but both achieved their primary short-term objectives. However, the deal was fiercely opposed from the start by powerful critics, most notably Israel and conservative factions within the United States. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was one of its most vocal detractors, famously delivering a speech to the US Congress where he called it a historic mistake that paved the way for Iran to get a bomb, not prevent it. Opponents argued that the deal's sunset clauses, which allowed certain restrictions to expire after 10 to 15 years, were a fatal flaw. They also contended that the agreement failed to address Iran's ballistic missile program or its support for regional proxies, effectively rewarding the regime without curbing its other destabilizing activities in the Middle East. The fate of the JCPOA was sealed in May 2018, when President Donald Trump, fulfilling a key campaign promise, unilaterally withdrew the United States from the agreement. He called it the worst deal ever negotiated and immediately reimposed draconian sanctions under a maximum pressure campaign designed to cripple the Iranian economy and force it back to the negotiating table for a better deal. This decision shattered the transatlantic consensus and plunged the region back into crisis. Iran, initially patient, began to incrementally violate the terms of the JCPOA in response, restarting advanced centrifuge research and increasing its stockpile of enriched uranium. The collapse of the deal dismantled the only diplomatic off-ramp, reigniting the very nuclear crisis it was designed to prevent and setting Iran and the United States on a direct collision course. Following the US withdrawal from the JCPOA, the simmering conflict moved from the negotiating table back into the shadows, escalating into a clandestine war of sabotage and assassination. Unexplained explosions started rocking sensitive Iranian military and nuclear sites with alarming regularity. Facilities like the Natanz enrichment plant suffered major fires and power outages, which Iran publicly blamed on Israeli sabotage. These acts were designed to be deniable, yet devastating, aimed at systematically degrading Iran's nuclear infrastructure from within. This campaign marked a significant escalation, moving beyond sanctions to direct physical disruption while maintaining plausible deniability. But the shadow war wasn't limited to infrastructure. A key component involved the targeted killing of Iran's top nuclear scientists, a tactic long attributed to Israel's Mossad. The most high-profile assassination happened in November 2020, when Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, the father of Iran's nuclear program, was killed in a sophisticated ambush outside Tehran. His death was a major blow to the program's leadership and a clear message that no one was beyond reach. These assassinations were intended to sow fear and paranoia, disrupting knowledge transfer and slowing progress by eliminating indispensable figures. In response, Iran retaliated through asymmetric means. It ramped up support for proxy forces across the Middle East, who increased attacks on US and Israeli interests. American military bases in Iraq came under frequent rocket fire, and commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz faced harassment by Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps. Iran also expanded its cyber warfare capabilities, launching attacks against critical infrastructure. This tit-for-tat escalation created a perilous feedback loop, where each action prompted a reaction, steadily raising the stakes and risk of miscalculation. This period created an atmosphere of extreme tension. Both sides engaged in a high-stakes game of cat and mouse, constantly testing red lines and capabilities. Intelligence warnings grew more dire as Iran accelerated uranium enrichment to unprecedented levels, inching closer to weapons-grade purity. For US and Israeli planners, the window to act was closing. The belief grew that sanctions and sabotage were no longer enough. The shadow war had reached its limit, and decision-makers in Washington and Tel Aviv concluded that direct military intervention would soon be necessary to avert an unacceptable outcome. The build-up to Operation Midnight Hammer was marked by a flurry of increasingly urgent political statements and intelligence leaks, signaling that a major military confrontation was imminent. In Washington, the rhetoric from the Trump administration became more bellicose. Officials spoke openly about all options being on the table, a diplomatic euphemism for military action. President Trump himself issued stark warnings to Tehran, promising, and I quote, consequences the likes of which few throughout history have ever suffered before if Iran continued on its nuclear path. This public posturing was designed to serve as a final ultimatum, a clear signal that the era of strategic patience was over and that the United States was prepared to use overwhelming force to achieve its objectives. At the same time, intelligence agencies began to paint a grim picture of Iran's nuclear progress. Reports from the IEA confirmed that Iran had amassed a significant stockpile of uranium enriched to 60% purity, a level just a short technical step away from the 90% needed for a weapon. Leaks from Western intelligence services suggested that Iran was making headway on the complex process of weaponization, including the development of detonator systems and the miniaturization of a warhead to fit on a ballistic missile. These alarming assessments created a sense of impending crisis, convincing many policymakers that Iran was on the verge of crossing a point of no return, a threshold beyond which its nuclear capability could no longer be contained by non-military means. On the Israeli side, the warnings were even more explicit. The Israeli defense minister declared that Israel would not allow a nuclear Iran and was preparing for every possible scenario to prevent it. Israeli military leaders conducted large-scale drills simulating a long-range strike on Iran's nuclear facilities, a clear and public display of their intent and capability. This was not mere saber-rattling. It was a deliberate preparation for a conflict that many in the Israeli security establishment had long seen as inevitable. The political statements from Tel Aviv were unambiguous. If diplomacy failed and Iran did not back down, Israel would act with or without the explicit support of its allies to neutralize the threat. In the final weeks leading up to the strikes, the diplomatic channels went cold. Last-ditch efforts by European powers to revive the nuclear deal and de-escalate the situation proved futile. Iran, emboldened by its nuclear progress and unwilling to capitulate to what it saw as American bullying, refused to make concessions without a full lifting of sanctions. The United States and Israel, convinced that Iran was just playing for time, saw no further room for negotiation. The stage was set. The political justifications had been laid out, the intelligence warnings had reached a fever pitch, and the military assets were in position. The road to crisis had reached its end, and the world held its breath as the countdown to war began. In the final days, the world was really on a knife's edge as the pieces for a major military operation fell into place. United States B-2 Spirit stealth bombers, which were honestly the only aircraft capable of delivering those massive GBU-57 bunker-buster bombs needed to penetrate Iran's deepest facilities, were quietly repositioned to forward bases in the region. Naval carrier strike groups moved into the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea, tightening the military cordon around Iran. The heightened military activity was just impossible to hide, tracked by commercial satellites and military observers worldwide. These movements, well, they were the final, physical confirmation that the political rhetoric was about to translate into devastating kinetic action. The build-up was a clear and deliberate message of overwhelming force, intended to intimidate but also signaling that the decision to strike had already been made. Intelligence chatter reached a fever pitch. Coded communications intercepted by global intelligence agencies indicated that a multi-pronged attack was being coordinated between United States and Israeli forces. The plans were rumored to involve not just airstrikes but also sophisticated cyber attacks aimed at disabling Iran's air defense network and command and control systems in the critical opening moments of the operation. Warnings were issued to commercial airlines to avoid Iranian airspace, and embassies in the region quietly went on high alert, bracing for the inevitable fallout. For those watching closely, the signs were unmistakable. A meticulously planned large-scale military operation was no longer a possibility, but a certainty waiting only for the final go. The political justification for the impending conflict was cemented in a final fiery speech by President Trump. He declared that Iran had repeatedly violated its international obligations and spurned every diplomatic overture, leaving the world with no choice but to act. He framed the operation not as an act of aggression, but as a necessary defensive measure to prevent a rogue regime from acquiring the world's most dangerous weapons. This narrative was crucial for building a coalition of support, or at least acquiescence, from international partners. It cast the United States and Israel as reluctant enforcers of global security, forced into action by an intransigent and dangerous adversary, thereby providing a powerful public rationale for the war to continue. As the fallout was tempting, a sense of grim inevitability settled over the region. Iran, fully aware of the impending threat, placed its military in its highest state of alert, vowing a crushing response to any attack on its soil. Its leaders mobilized the populace with nationalist fervor, preparing their people for a conflict they portrayed as a heroic defense of their nation's sovereignty against foreign aggression. The battle lines were drawn, the narratives were set, and the space for de-escalation had vanished. The long road to crisis, paved with decades of mistrust, broken deals, and shadow wars, had led to this moment. The world watched in trepidation as the final countdown ended, and Operation Midnight Hammer was unleashed, plunging the Middle East into a new and terrifying chapter of conflict. The operation, codenamed Midnight Hammer, commenced precisely as its name suggested, under the deep cover of darkness on June 22nd. The initial wave of attacks was, honestly, a symphony of advanced military technology, designed to be swift, overwhelming, and decisive. United States Air Force B-2. Spirit stealth bombers, having taken off from distant air bases and refueled in mid-air, slipped undetected through the gaps in Iran's air defense network. Their primary targets were the three crown jewels of Iran's nuclear program: the deeply buried Fordow fuel enrichment plant, the sprawling Natanz enrichment facility, and the critical uranium conversion facility at Isfahan. These sites, long the focus of international concern and Israeli contingency planning, were about to face the full and unbridled fury of American air power. The night sky over Iran, usually calm, was pierced by the silent passage of these ghostly aircraft on their deadly mission. The strategy was multi-layered, beginning with a sophisticated electronic and cyber warfare assault. Before the first bombs fell, United States and Israeli cyber units allegedly unleashed malicious code aimed at paralyzing Iran's command, control, and communications infrastructure. Radar installations were blinded, air defense batteries were rendered inert, and communication links between military commanders were severed. This digital onslaught was intended to create a state of confusion and paralysis, ensuring the attacking bombers could reach their targets without facing significant resistance. The goal was to dismantle Iran's ability to defend itself before the physical destruction even began, making the subsequent airstrikes a foregone conclusion. The silent war in cyberspace was the crucial first act that set the stage for the kinetic onslaught that would follow, a testament to modern warfare's reliance on integrated digital and physical attacks. Following the cyber assault, the physical strikes began. The B-2S, flying at high altitude, released their payloads with pinpoint precision. The weapon of choice for the most hardened target, the Fordow facility, was the GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator, a 30,000-pound bunker-buster bomb designed specifically for this type of mission. For Natanz and Isfahan, a combination of smaller precision-guided munitions was used to target specific surface buildings, workshops, and centrifuge halls. The operation was not a blunt instrument of destruction, but a surgical procedure intended to excise the core components of the nuclear program while minimizing collateral damage. Each target had been meticulously mapped, each building's function analyzed, and each weapon selected to achieve a specific destructive effect, from cratering hardened bunkers to collapsing industrial structures. The 12-day military operation was not a single event, but a sustained campaign. After the initial shock and awe strikes by the United States, Israeli forces reportedly took on the role of conducting follow-up strikes and targeting secondary sites. These included suspected missile production facilities, drone manufacturing plants, and the command centers of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. This division of labor played to the strengths of both partners. America's unique capability to deliver massive ordnance against the most fortified targets, and Israel's regional proximity and intelligence dominance for sustained pressure and targeting of a wider set of military assets. The combined effort was meant to ensure that Iran's entire military-industrial complex related to its nuclear and missile programs was systematically dismantled over the course of nearly 2 weeks, leaving the regime crippled and its ambitions in ruins. The primary challenge of Operation Midnight Hammer was always the Fordo fuel enrichment plant. Buried up to 300 feet beneath a solid rock mountain near the city of Qom, it was designed to be, well, pretty much impervious to conventional air attack. This facility represented Iran's ultimate insurance policy, a place where enrichment could continue even if all other sites were destroyed. Therefore, the success of the entire operation hinged on the ability of the GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator to do what no other conventional weapon could: penetrate hundreds of feet of rock and reinforced concrete and annihilate the centrifuge halls hidden within. The B-2 bombers had to fly a precise trajectory, releasing the massive bombs at the exact angle and altitude required to maximize their kinetic energy and burrowing potential before detonation. The technology behind the bunker buster is honestly a marvel of destructive engineering. The GBU-57 is not merely an explosive, it is a high-speed projectile encased in a hardened steel shell. Upon impact, it does not detonate immediately. Instead, it uses its immense weight and velocity to tunnel deep underground. A sophisticated hardened electronic fuse, equipped with an accelerometer, counts the number of layers or decks it has penetrated. Only when it reaches the pre-programmed depth, the location of the target bunker, does the massive 5,300-pound warhead explode. This delayed detonation is crucial, as it ensures the full force of the blast is contained within the underground facility, creating an artificial earthquake that is designed to collapse the tunnels and pulverize everything inside, from delicate centrifuges to control systems. The Pentagon's public presentation of the strikes focused heavily on this technological feat. They released satellite images showing at least 6 distinct impact points on the mountain above Fordo, presenting these massive craters as definitive evidence of successful strikes. The implication was clear. Each impact represented a GBU-57 that had successfully breached the mountain's defenses. The official narrative was one of unmitigated success, claiming that the once impregnable fortress had been compromised and its contents obliterated. This claim was central to their argument that the Iranian nuclear program had suffered an irreversible blow. The ability to destroy Fordo was presented as the ultimate proof of American military dominance and the futility of any attempt by adversaries to hide their most valuable assets. However, the physics of such uncertainty, while the GBU-57 is officially or an unspecified witness depth. They argued that even if the bombs penetrated deep into the mountain, the blast's effects might have been dissipated by the surrounding rock, potentially leaving some of the centrifuge cascades damaged but not destroyed. The visual evidence of craters on the surface proved the bombs had hit their mark, but it could not definitively prove what had happened hundreds of feet below, leaving a critical gap between the Pentagon's claims and verifiable reality. In the wake of the strikes, the Pentagon launched a media blitz, declaring Iran's nuclear program obliterated. President Trump and Defense Secretary Hextall showcased satellite images before intact facilities, after smoldering ruins. Officials claimed not just infrastructure, but scientists and uranium stockpiles were destroyed. Total victory. Yet cracks appeared. General Mackenzie's cautious language, severe damage instead of obliteration, hinted at a less certain reality. Analysts and journalists questioned the absolute certainty, suspecting political spin over military fact. The Pentagon's narrative, meant to close the book on Iran's nuclear threat, instead raised doubts about what was truly accomplished. The world was left wondering if the story of obliteration was more theater than truth. Within 2 days, the Pentagon's narrative unraveled. A leaked Defense Intelligence Agency report contradicted claims of total success, suggesting Iran's nuclear infrastructure could be rebuilt within months. The leak exposed a rift between political leaders and intelligence experts, fueling skepticism in Washington and abroad. Iran seized the moment, claiming they'd moved key assets before the attack, implying the US struck empty buildings. President Trump lashed out at the media, but offered no proof to counter the doubts. The administration's refusal to address the uranium's fate deepened suspicions. The world now faced a murky reality, with the truth buried beneath layers of propaganda and denial. The fate of Iran's 408 kilograms of enriched uranium became the central mystery. Despite claims of obliteration, the US offered no evidence the uranium was destroyed. Reports suggested the stockpile was portable and likely moved before the strikes. Analysts speculated it could be hidden in secret sites or even under Russian protection. Without proof of its destruction, the threat remained, perhaps more dangerous, now hidden and unaccounted for. The Pentagon's focus on infrastructure meant little if the uranium survived. Operation Midnight Hammer may have simply driven the problem underground, leaving the world in greater uncertainty. To silence critics, the Pentagon unveiled a definitive video, only to reveal old test footage, not evidence from Iran. The video showed a bunker buster hitting a thin concrete slab, not the deep fortified Iranian sites. Experts immediately noted the bomb's real-world effectiveness was unproven. The footage failed to demonstrate actual success, instead highlighting the Pentagon's lack of concrete proof. The press conference backfired, fueling more skepticism and undermining official claims. The attempt to project strength became a public relations fiasco. The true outcome of the operation remained as uncertain as ever. With US credibility shaken, Iran launched its own propaganda offensive, showing resilience and minimal damage. State media broadcast images of recovery, while officials claimed they'd outsmarted the Americans by moving assets in advance. Yet Iran also mourned top scientists, hinting at real losses. The world was caught between US boasts of obliteration and Iran's claims of survival. Both sides spun conflicting stories, leaving the truth obscured. The information war shaped global perceptions, fueling tension and uncertainty. In this fog of propaganda, the real outcome of Operation Midnight Hammer remained elusive. Beyond the public posturing and propaganda, a quieter and more consequential battle was being waged within the world's intelligence agencies. The initial leaked DIA report was just the beginning of a complex and ongoing process of battle damage assessment. Using a combination of satellite imagery from optical to radar and thermal, signals intelligence and human sources on the ground, agencies from the CIA to Israel's Mossad and Europe's security services were working around the clock to build a precise picture of the aftermath. This was painstaking work. Analysts had to differentiate between a collapsed building and a strategically destroyed one, assess the functionality of partially damaged equipment, and most difficult of all, try to determine what had been inside the facilities when they were struck. The conclusions of these intelligence agencies were far from uniform, reflecting the inherent ambiguity of the situation. While there was broad agreement that the surface facilities at Natanz and Isfahan had suffered catastrophic damage, the assessment of the underground Fordow site remained hotly contested. Some reports, leaning on seismic data from the GBU-57 impacts, suggested that the blasts had likely caused extensive internal collapse, rendering the centrifuge halls inoperable for years. Other assessments were more conservative, arguing that without ground truth verification, it was impossible to know for sure. They posited that some centrifuge cascades, protected by internal blast doors and the sheer mass of the mountain, might have survived, capable of being brought back online much sooner than anticipated. The most critical point of divergence was the fate of Iran's human and material capital. While the US administration framed the death of 14 scientists as a crippling blow, many intelligence assessments pointed out that Iran's program involved thousands of scientists and engineers. The loss was significant, but likely not fatal to the program as a whole, as replacements could be promoted from within. The biggest intelligence black hole, however, remained the 408 kilograms of enriched uranium. European intelligence agencies in particular leaned toward the assessment that Iran had successfully moved the stockpile. Their reports, shared with allies, cautioned that the most immediate proliferation threat had not been neutralized and may have become even more acute, as the material was now in the wild and outside the purview of any international monitoring. This battle of assessments had profound strategic implications. If the more optimistic US view was correct, the military operation had been a success, setting Iran's program back by a decade. This would justify the maximum pressure policy and embolden hawks calling for further military action to finish the job. However, if the more pessimistic European and DIA assessments were closer to the truth, the operation was a strategic misstep. It had failed to eliminate the core threat, had potentially pushed Iran to accelerate its weaponization efforts in secret, and had brought the region to the brink of a major war for what amounted to a temporary delay. The future course of the conflict hinged on which of these intelligence assessments policymakers in Washington, Tel Aviv, and other world capitals chose to believe. Ultimately, the media and intelligence battle culminated in a massive credibility gap for the Trump administration. The stark contrast between the president's absolute claims of obliteration and the cautious, contradictory assessments from his own intelligence agencies, not to mention the flawed video evidence, had really damaged the White House's trustworthiness on the world stage. Allies who had been asked to support the operation were now left questioning the fundamental premise of the strikes. The administration's aggressive public relations campaign, designed to project strength and control, had in fact achieved the opposite effect, making them appear deceptive and, honestly, a bit incompetent in their management of the post-conflict narrative. This credibility gap extended to the American public and Congress. Lawmakers, who had been briefed in classified settings, began to leak their concerns to the press, hinting that the public narrative did not match the intelligence they were seeing. This created a domestic political firestorm, with critics accusing the administration of misleading the American people about the effectiveness and necessity of a military action that could have led to a full-blown war. The debate shifted from whether the strikes were justified to whether the president could be trusted to provide an honest account of their results. The entire episode began to draw parallels with past intelligence failures, eroding public confidence in the government's ability to handle critical national security matters. For Iran, this credibility gap was a strategic gift. The more the US administration's story unraveled, the more plausible Iran's counter-narrative seemed. Tehran was able to position itself as the victim of unjustified aggression and, somewhat remarkably, as a more reliable source of information than the White House. This allowed them to garner sympathy in some international forums and sow discord among America's allies, weakening the international coalition that had enforced sanctions. By successfully muddying the waters and casting doubt on every American claim, Iran managed to turn a military defeat into a significant information warfare victory, showing that in modern conflict, controlling the narrative can be just as important as controlling the battlefield. In the end, the media and intelligence battle left the world with more questions than answers. The true extent of the damage to Iran's nuclear program remained shrouded in secrecy and speculation. The whereabouts of the enriched uranium were unknown, creating a new and more terrifying kind of threat. And the word of the US government, the supposed guarantor of the international order, was in tatters. The conflict had moved from a physical confrontation to a war over truth itself, a battle of perception where victory was not measured in craters and destroyed buildings, but in the ability to shape what the world believed. This profound uncertainty set a dangerous and unstable stage for the next act of the crisis, where decisions would have to be made based on incomplete information and broken trust. In the hazy aftermath of the 12-day war, The most immediate task for observers was to tally the physical destruction inflicted upon Iran's nuclear infrastructure. Open-source analysis, combining commercial satellite imagery with official statements, painted a picture of widespread yet strategically focused devastation. The surface facilities at Natanz and Isfahan bore the most visible scars. At Natanz, the main centrifuge assembly halls, which were above ground, were completely destroyed, their roofs caved in and their structures reduced to a twisted mess of metal and concrete. Similarly, the uranium conversion facility at Isfahan, responsible for the crucial first step of turning uranium ore into the gas needed for enrichment, appeared to have been flattened. These were significant losses, representing years of investment and technological development, now gone up in smoke. However, the question of underground facilities remained the most contentious and critical part of the damage assessment. While the Pentagon showed 6 impact craters above the 408kg enrichment plant, the actual damage to the centrifuge halls buried deep below was impossible to confirm visually from space. The sheer kinetic force of multiple GBU-57 impacts would have undoubtedly sent cataclysmic shockwaves through the mountain, likely damaging sensitive equipment, collapsing some tunnels, and disrupting power and water lines. Even if some centrifuges survived the initial blasts, the intricate network of pipes and wiring connecting them would have been severely compromised, rendering them useless without extensive and time-consuming repairs in a highly unstable underground environment. Beyond the 3 primary nuclear sites, the sustained 12-day campaign also targeted the broader support network of Iran's program. This included alleged weaponization research sites, such as the facility near Sanjayan village, which was reportedly working on detonator systems. It also encompassed missile production plants and drone factories, which were essential for Iran's delivery systems. The goal was clearly not just to halt enrichment, but to cripple the entire ecosystem required to build and deploy a nuclear weapon. The destruction of these secondary sites represented a major setback, forcing Iran to contend with rebuilding not just its core nuclear facilities, but also the vital peripheral industries that supported them, a far more complex and resource-intensive undertaking. In comparison, the physical damage sustained by Israel was significantly less but not non-existent. While its multi-layered air defense systems, including the Iron Dome, David's Sling and Arrow, intercepted the majority of Iranian missiles and drones, some inevitably got through. Reports, though heavily censored by the Israeli military, spoke of impacts on both military and civilian infrastructure. The Nevatim air base in the Negev desert, a critical hub for Israel's F-35 fleet, was reportedly struck, causing damage to runways and hangars. Sporadic impacts were also reported in urban areas, causing damage to buildings and sowing panic among the population. While not strategically crippling, these successful strikes demonstrated Iran's ability to penetrate Israel's vaunted defenses, a psychological blow that shattered the nation's sense of invulnerability. Beyond the rubble of destroyed buildings, the conflict exacted a severe and perhaps more lasting human toll, particularly on Iran's scientific community. The state funerals for 14 of the nation's top nuclear scientists and engineers were a somber admission of a devastating loss. These individuals were not simply employees. They were the institutional memory of the entire program, possessing decades of accumulated knowledge, experience, and technical expertise that just can't be easily replaced. They were the mentors, the project leaders, and the brilliant minds who had solved countless complex problems to advance Iran's nuclear ambitions. Their deaths created a leadership and knowledge vacuum at the very heart of the program, a blow far more difficult to recover from than rebuilding a physical structure. Critics of the operation argued that this was the most cynical and effective part of the entire campaign. While a building can be rebuilt and equipment can be replaced, the intricate web of knowledge held within a small group of elite scientists is fragile and perishable. The targeted killings, whether by airstrike or other means during the conflict, were designed to decapitate the program's intellectual leadership. It is one thing to have thousands of engineers capable of following blueprints. It is another entirely to have the master architects who can draw them. The loss of these 14 key figures would inevitably slow down any rebuilding effort, introduce errors into complex processes, and create a climate of fear that would deter the next generation of bright minds from joining such a dangerous field. However, it is also true that Iran's nuclear program is a large and resilient enterprise. It is not the work of just a handful of individuals, but a national project involving thousands of highly educated scientists, technicians, and engineers. While the loss of the top tier of leadership is undeniably a major setback, there is a deep bench of talent ready to step up. For every Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, there are numerous deputies and protégés who have worked alongside him for years. The program has been the target of assassinations for over a decade, and it has developed systems of redundancy and knowledge transfer to mitigate such losses. The human cost was grievous, but to assume it was a fatal blow would be to underestimate the depth and determination of the Iranian scientific establishment. On the Israeli side, the human cost was measured primarily in military casualties and civilian trauma. While official numbers were kept under wraps, the constant barrage of missile alerts and the occasional successful strike took a heavy psychological toll. The national routine was disrupted as citizens spent nights in bomb shelters, and the economy suffered as businesses closed and tourism evaporated. For the Israeli military, operating air defense systems at full capacity for 12 straight days was an exhausting and high-stress endeavor. While the casualty figures were far lower than Iran's, the conflict reinforced the grim reality that Israel's technological superiority does not grant it complete immunity, and that any future war with Iran and its proxies would be fought not just on distant battlefields, but in the skies over Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. The fallout from the 12-day war extended far beyond the immediate physical and human damage, inflicting a staggering economic blow on both nations, though the impact was far from symmetrical. For Iran, an economy already contorted and weakened by years of crippling international sanctions, the cost was catastrophic. Independent estimates, such as those from TRT World, placed the direct economic damage and military expenditure for Iran at somewhere between $24 and $35 billion. This figure, representing a massive 6 to 9% of Iran's total GDP, is a devastating sum for a country struggling with hyperinflation, high unemployment, and crumbling public services. The cost of this brief war could set back Iran's economic development by years, if not a decade. This enormous financial burden encompassed several factors. It included the cost of mobilizing the military, firing hundreds of missiles and drones, and the immense value of the destroyed infrastructure at the nuclear sites and other military facilities. Rebuilding these hardened, high-tech facilities will require billions of dollars and access to specialized technology that is now even harder to acquire under the renewed scrutiny of the international community. The war also disrupted what little trade Iran was able to conduct, further depressing its oil revenues and scaring off any potential foreign investment. In essence, the conflict served as an acute economic shock on top of the chronic illness of sanctions, pushing the Iranian economy closer to the brink of total collapse. For Israel, the economic cost was also substantial, though its robust, diversified, and heavily subsidized economy was far better equipped to absorb the shock. Estimates suggested that simply operating its sophisticated air defense systems and conducting its own offensive operations cost Israel around $725 million per day. Over the 12-day period, the total direct military cost for Israel amounted to between $11 and $18 billion. While a huge sum, this represents a much smaller fraction of its GDP, somewhere between 2 and 3%. This figure, however, does not include the indirect costs of lost productivity, the shutdown of businesses, the collapse in tourism, and the damage to infrastructure from the Iranian missiles that made it through their defenses. The economic fallout highlights the asymmetric nature of the conflict. While Israel spent billions on high-tech interceptor missiles, each costing millions of dollars, to shoot down Iranian drones and missiles that cost only a few $1,000s to produce, the strategic calculus is more complex. The war forced Israel to expend a significant portion of its expensive, limited stock interceptors, a resource that is not easily replenished. For Iran, the economic damage was far greater in absolute terms and as a percentage of its economy. But the conflict also demonstrated its ability to impose significant costs on a technologically and economically superior adversary, a key tenet of its asymmetric warfare doctrine. The economic pain was a weapon in itself, wielded by both sides to wear down the other's will to fight. In the wake of the devastation, the crucial question becomes, how quickly can Iran recover and rebuild its nuclear program? The answer is complex, hinging on several key factors, some of which were severely damaged and others that remain surprisingly intact. The most significant blow was to Iran's physical infrastructure for producing nuclear fuel. The destruction of the Isfahan uranium conversion facility is a major choke point. Without the ability to convert natural uranium ore into uranium hexafluoride gas, the centrifuges, wherever they may be, have nothing to enrich. Rebuilding this complex chemical processing plant would be a multi-year effort requiring specialized equipment that is subject to strict international export controls, making it a formidable, though not impossible, challenge. Similarly, the destruction of the main centrifuge assembly workshops at Natanz is a serious setback. While Iran may have stockpiles of components or even fully assembled centrifuges hidden elsewhere, its ability to mass-produce new, more advanced models has been severely degraded. However, Iran has a history of clandestine procurement and reverse engineering, and it is likely that the knowledge and blueprints for producing these machines survived. The more difficult challenge will be re-establishing the pristine, controlled environments necessary for assembling these highly sensitive devices. Any attempt to do so would be a primary target for ongoing surveillance and potential future strikes, forcing Iran to work in smaller, more dispersed and less efficient clandestine workshops. Despite these major losses, Iran retains its most valuable assets, its human capital, and a potential stockpile of enriched material. As discussed, while the loss of key scientists is damaging, thousands of skilled personnel remain. More importantly, if Iran successfully moved its 408kg stockpile of enriched uranium before the strikes, it possesses the one ingredient that takes the most time and effort to produce. With this material in hand, the pathway to a weapon is significantly shorter, bypassing the need for large-scale enrichment. The challenge would then shift to the final, difficult steps of weaponization, perfecting a reliable detonation system and designing a warhead, tasks that can be performed in smaller, harder-to-detect laboratories. Ultimately, Iran's capacity to rebuild will be a race against time, pitting its indigenous ingenuity and determination against the unblinking eye of foreign intelligence and the constant threat of further military action. The country has proven to be remarkably resilient in the face of decades of pressure. It will likely adopt a dispersal and concealment strategy, breaking the program down into smaller, redundant components hidden across the country, making it harder to track and target. While the timeline for reconstituting the full-scale industrial program seen before the war is now measured in years, the timeline for a potential sprint to a single crude device using pre-existing enriched material may have become alarmingly short, creating a more ambiguous and dangerous strategic environment. When the dust settles and the costs are tallied, the final question is a strategic one. Who came out ahead in this violent exchange? For the United States and Israel, the operation achieved its primary tactical objective of inflicting massive damage on Iran's known nuclear infrastructure, setting back its program by several years. They demonstrated overwhelming military force and showcased their technological superiority, breaching even the most hardened facilities. This sent a powerful message of deterrence to Iran and other regional adversaries. From this perspective, the mission was a success, buying time and re-establishing a red line. However, this tactical victory may have come at the cost of a strategic setback. The failure to account for the enriched uranium means the threat may not have been eliminated, but merely displaced and hidden. Iran may now abandon all pretenses and pursue a clandestine weaponization program with newfound urgency and justification. The strikes may have destroyed the international monitoring regime, pushing the Iranian program into the dark and making it harder to track and contain. The operation may have traded a known problem for an unknown, unpredictable one. For Iran, the calculus is equally mixed. The country suffered devastating losses that will take years to overcome. its vulnerability was laid bare. However, Iran also scored significant points. It proved its ability to endure a massive assault and retaliate by penetrating Israeli airspace, shattering its enemy's sense of security. The conflict allowed the regime to rally the population, silencing internal dissent. Most importantly, if they protected their uranium, they may now hold the ultimate trump card, possessing bomb material while freed from international inspections. Ultimately, it's difficult to declare a clear winner. The conflict resulted in a dangerous stalemate, a lose-lose scenario for regional stability. Israel and the US achieved temporary advantage, but may have worsened the proliferation risk. Iran absorbed a terrible blow, but may be closer to nuclear deterrent, armed with victimhood and defiance. Operation Midnight Hammer didn't resolve the crisis. It transformed it into a more perilous phase, where diplomatic solutions are harder to see, and the shadow of future conflict looms larger. The single most terrifying question haunting the corridors of power from Washington to Jerusalem is the fate of the 408 kilograms of enriched uranium. This material, the ghost at the feast of claimed victory, represents the delta between a temporary setback for Iran and an existential threat to the region. The silence from the White House on this specific issue is deafening, suggesting an intelligence failure of the highest order. If the primary goal of Operation Midnight Hammer was to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, then failing to secure or destroy its core ingredient constitutes a catastrophic mission failure. The world is now confronted with the chilling possibility that a quantity of near-weapons-grade material sufficient for multiple atomic bombs is in the wild, its location and status completely unknown to the outside world, a rogue element in an already volatile equation. This unanswered question radically alters the strategic landscape, transforming a problem of proliferation into one of nuclear security. Before the strikes, the uranium was under the, albeit limited, purview of the IEA at known sites. Now it has vanished. Speculation runs rampant among intelligence agencies. Was it moved to a new, undeclared and deeply buried facility far from the prying eyes of satellites? Or was it divided into smaller, more easily transportable caches and dispersed across the country, hidden in unassuming warehouses or civilian facilities? An even more alarming theory suggests it may have been transferred to a proxy group or even a third-party state, a nightmarish scenario that would exponentially complicate any attempt to recover it. The uncertainty itself is a weapon, creating paranoia and instability. The inability to account for the uranium renders any claims of success hollow and premature. Even with its primary enrichment facilities in ruins, possessing this material means Iran has already completed the most arduous and time-consuming part of the journey to a bomb. The complex, energy-intensive process of enriching uranium, which takes years and vast industrial infrastructure, is no longer a barrier. The Iranian regime, feeling cornered and existentially threatened after the devastating attacks, now has a powerful incentive to safeguard this material at all costs, and potentially proceed with the final stages of weaponization in absolute secrecy. The ghost of the missing uranium looms over every diplomatic calculation, a constant reminder that the crisis, far from being over, may have just entered its most dangerous and unpredictable phase. Therefore, the immediate future of global security hinges on a desperate intelligence hunt. A silent, high-stakes search is undoubtedly underway, with every available asset, from spies on the ground to advanced satellite sensors, tasked with finding this nuclear needle in a haystack the size of Iran. Every unusual heat signature, every suspicious convoy, every piece of intercepted chatter will be scrutinized for clues. The fate of the region could well depend on the success or failure of this clandestine search. Until the uranium is located and its status confirmed, the world is left to grapple with the terrifying ambiguity of a threshold nuclear state whose most dangerous asset has gone completely off the grid, leaving a profound and unnerving silence where an answer should be. With the potential survival of its enriched uranium stockpile, the next critical question is whether Iran still possesses the capability to complete the final intricate steps toward building a nuclear weapon. A bomb is more than just a lump of fissile material. It requires a sophisticated delivery and detonation mechanism. Two crucial steps remain: perfecting a highly sensitive detonator system for a controlled implosion, and designing a molecular neutron initiator, to kickstart the nuclear chain reaction. These are formidable engineering challenges that require specialized knowledge and precision manufacturing, representing the final technical hurdles between Iran and membership in the nuclear club. The success or failure of the recent strikes must also be measured against their impact on these specific non-nuclear components of the weaponization process. Intelligence reports before the conflict pointed to a facility near the village of Sanjayan, north of Tehran, as a key site for this type of research. This facility, which was not under IEA surveillance, was allegedly focused on developing shockwave generators and other components related to nuclear triggers. According to American and Israeli media reports, this site was also targeted and destroyed during the 12-day campaign. If this was Iran's sole facility for such work, and if it was completely destroyed, then the strikes may have successfully severed a critical link in the weaponization chain. This would mean that even with the uranium, Iran would lack the trigger mechanism, forcing them into another multi-year research and development effort to reconstitute this capability from scratch under intense international scrutiny. However, the situation is shrouded in ambiguity, creating a 50-50 proposition. It is entirely possible that the work at Sanjayan was merely a single part of a larger dispersed program. Iran is known to use a web of front companies and dual-use research centers, making it exceedingly difficult to track all potential weaponization activities. The real work could have been taking place underground at the same site, or at a dozen other undeclared locations that the IEA was never allowed to inspect. If Iran's weaponization research was redundant and concealed, as its enrichment program was, then the destruction of the Sanjayan facility might be a cosmetic blow, leaving the core of the program intact and still capable of producing the necessary components for a bomb. The final piece of the puzzle is the delivery system. A nuclear weapon is useless without a reliable means to deliver it to a target. This requires long-range ballistic missiles, hypersonic cruise missiles, or advanced fighter jets. This is one area where Iran possesses a proven and robust capability. It has a large and diverse stockpile of ballistic missiles, a mature manufacturing industry, and has even supplied its proxies in Yemen and Lebanon with advanced systems. While the strikes may have targeted some production facilities, Iran's missile program is vast and geographically dispersed. It is highly probable that Iran retains the ability to mount a nuclear warhead on a missile and launch it, meaning this crucial part of the path to a deliverable nuclear weapon remains wide open and operational. Given the ambiguous outcome of Operation Midnight Hammer, the strategic calculus for both sides points toward a future of sustained, low-level conflict rather than lasting peace. For Israel, the mission is fundamentally incomplete. The defense minister's call to apply a Lebanon model to Iran is essentially a declaration of perpetual warfare. This strategy entails maintaining constant military pressure through continuous airstrikes to prevent the nuclear program's reconstitution, degrade its missile production, and sever its support for regional proxies. This is not a plan for peace, but a blueprint for a permanent war of attrition, an attempt to enforce Israel's military and technological superiority over Iran indefinitely. The logic is clear. If the first major strike was not decisive, then a relentless series of smaller strikes must follow. This Israeli strategy of enforcement is fraught with immense risk and cost. It would require Israel to maintain a constant state of high alert, conduct complex long-range operations on a regular basis, and potentially engage Iranian-backed forces directly on the borders of Syria and Iraq. The financial burden would be immense, running into billions of dollars per month, placing a severe strain on the Israeli economy. Furthermore, it would necessitate constant logistical support from the United States and the United Kingdom, particularly for aerial refueling, effectively making them permanent participants in the conflict. This perpetual war footing would be incredibly difficult to sustain politically and economically, locking Israel into a seemingly endless cycle of violence with no clear endgame in sight. Iran's response to this threat has been equally uncompromising. The Iranian foreign minister has stated unequivocally that if Israeli forces violate the ceasefire, Iran will deliver a decisive response without any restrictions. This is not an idle threat. The previous conflict demonstrated Iran's willingness to absorb a first strike and retaliate directly against Israeli territory, changing the long-standing rules of engagement. In any future exchange, Iran is unlikely to conduct another choreographed attack. It will likely aim to inflict maximum damage, potentially targeting critical infrastructure or population centers, and will not hesitate to unleash its proxies across the region to open multiple fronts against Israel simultaneously, creating a multifaceted and chaotic war. This sets the stage for a grim and volatile future. The so-called pause is merely a temporary reprieve, a moment for both sides to rearm, reassess, and prepare for the next round. President Trump's threat to attack Iran again, if it resumes nuclear activity, only adds another layer of instability. The fundamental drivers of the conflict, Israel's determination to prevent a nuclear Iran and Iran's determination to achieve what it sees as its sovereign right and strategic necessity, remain unresolved. Without a viable diplomatic path forward, the region is trapped in a dangerous security dilemma where each side's defensive actions are perceived as offensive threats by the other, making future rounds of conflict not just possible but tragically seem almost inevitable. In conclusion, the 12-day war and Operation Midnight Hammer have not brought clarity or security to the Middle East. Instead, they have shrouded the region in a deeper, more dangerous ambiguity. The central findings of this analysis reveal a conflict that ended without a decisive victor, leaving a legacy of unresolved questions and heightened tensions. While the United States and Israel successfully inflicted crippling damage on Iran's known overt nuclear infrastructure, their claims of total obliteration have been thoroughly undermined by intelligence leaks, contradictory evidence, and their own conspicuous silence on the most critical issue. The failure to account for the 408 kilograms of enriched uranium means the primary objective of the operation, eliminating the immediate threat of a nuclear-armed Iran, remains perilously unfulfilled, transforming the crisis rather than solving it. The region is unequivocally not safer today. The conflict has pushed Iran's nuclear ambitions from a monitored industrial program into the shadows, creating the terrifying possibility of a clandestine weaponization effort that is harder to track and impossible to control. The strategic fallout has created a lose-lose scenario. Iran has suffered devastating economic and material losses, pushing its regime into a corner where a nuclear deterrent may seem like its only guarantee of survival. Simultaneously, Israel, despite its tactical military successes, now faces a more determined adversary and the prospect of a perpetual costly war of attrition to enforce a fragile status quo. The so-called peace is merely a pause in a long-term struggle, a temporary ceasefire in a conflict whose fundamental drivers remain firmly in place. The world is now left to grapple with the unresolved legacy of this brief but brutal war. The most critical question remains the mystery of the missing uranium. Its location and status will dictate the immediacy of the nuclear threat. Furthermore, the conflict has shattered any remaining hope for a diplomatic resolution in the near future, replacing the fragile framework of the JCPOA with a new paradigm of direct military confrontation. The established rules of engagement have been broken, and both sides have demonstrated a willingness to absorb and inflict direct attacks, setting a dangerous precedent for any future escalations. The international community must now navigate a landscape where trust has evaporated and the primary actors are locked in a cycle of threat and counter-threat. Looking forward, the world must watch for several key indicators that will signal the direction of this ongoing crisis. Any sign of Iran attempting to rebuild its major facilities, particularly the Isfahan conversion plant, will likely trigger a swift Israeli military response. Conversely, a prolonged period of quiet from Iran's program could be even more alarming, suggesting a shift to a covert strategy. The diplomatic dance between Iran, Russia, and China will be crucial, as their support could provide Tehran with the technical and political cover it needs to advance its goals. Ultimately, the war has resolved nothing. It has only reset the chessboard, leaving the pieces in a more precarious and volatile arrangement, with the risk of a regional conflagration higher than ever before.